Imagine a young woman, no older than 16, held in bondage on a deep South plantation. She's expecting her first child, a child she knows will not belong to her. She's scared, but a glimmer of hope remains that perhaps her child might have a better life. As her belly swells with pregnancy, so do her anxieties. She observes other pregnant women on the plantation, toiling relentlessly, forced into the same grueling labor as the rest of the enslaved community. She's aware that if she can't keep up, her punishment will be severe. As her due date approaches, fear transforms into sheer terror. She comprehends that childbirth, a perilous ordeal for any woman, poses even greater risks for her as an enslaved woman. There are no doctors to assist her, no midwives to guide her. Her only support comes from other enslaved women who will do their best to help her through this ordeal. But the horrors don't conclude there. If she survives childbirth, she will be expected to resume work within days. She must care for her newborn while laboring in the fields, with no respite or time to recover. And if, as often occurred, her child is forcibly taken away from her, she must endure the heart-wrenching knowledge that she may never see her baby again. This is the harsh reality that enslaved women faced during pregnancy and childbirth, a reality often concealed by history. In our education system, when we learn about the institution of slavery, we are taught about its inherent brutality. However, we are rarely exposed to the specific atrocities endured by pregnant women during this era. In this video, we aim to unearth the hidden history of the inhumane treatment of enslaved women during pregnancy and childbirth, shedding light on voices that have been silenced for far too long. But before we delve deeper into this troubling history, kindly consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a like. The practice of breeding enslaved people as if they were livestock was not a novel concept. It was a systematic and deliberate effort to increase the number of slaves, thereby bolstering the wealth of slave owners. To understand this practice better, let's rewind to the early 1600s when the transatlantic slave trade commenced. Initially, slavery was based not on race, but on captivity. If you were taken captive and sold into slavery, you became an enslaved person. However, this changed over time, and slavery became a profitable endeavor. Laws were enacted to ensure that enslaved Africans remained in bondage for life, with no rights, and could be passed down through generations. Enslaved individuals were regarded as property and treated accordingly. By the 1800s, slave breeding had evolved into a profitable industry, with breeding farms and houses established across the country to facilitate the practice. One of the most infamous breeding farms was known as the Weeping Time, situated in Savannah, Georgia, and owned by Pierce Mies Butler, a wealthy plantation owner. Shockingly, Pierce Mies Butler was not just a slave owner, he was also considered one of the founding fathers of the United States. Despite his role in shaping the nation's history, he saw nothing wrong with exploiting enslaved women as breeders. The conditions within these breeding farms and houses were deplorable. Women were crammed into cramped quarters with inadequate ventilation, provided with meager sustenance, and denied essential medical care. Pregnant women were compelled to toil in the fields until the very day they gave birth. Even after childbirth, their infants were torn from their arms and sold to other plantation owners. Meanwhile, these women were coerced into continuing their grueling labor. Denied the fundamental right to be mothers and care for their children, they were subjected to unspeakable suffering. One woman whose story stands out is Harriet Jacobs, enslaved in North Carolina. Harriet was forced into a sexual relationship with her owner, leading to her pregnancy. As her owner's wife grew jealous and mistreated her, Harriet realized that her child would be forcibly taken away. In a desperate bid to preserve her family, Harriet ran away and hid in a cramped attic space in her grandmother's house for 7 years, watching her children grow up from a distance. These narratives provide just a glimpse into the profound suffering endured by enslaved women in the United States. These women were not only forced into reproductive servitude, matched with men selected to produce offspring deemed valuable by their owners, but they were also robbed of the basic right to care for their children. Yet, the horrors extended beyond this, as enslaved women were subjected to brutal and perilous birthing practices. These practices often resulted in injury, infection, and even death. They gave birth on plantation floors without medical assistance or pain relief, endured barbaric practices like the breaking of their pelvises, and were restrained in birthing chairs that made it easier for others to catch their newborns but left the women powerless and in pain. Most distressing is the fact that these practices occurred without the consent or understanding of the enslaved women involved. Furthermore, the deliberate suppression of their voices and experiences by those in power prevented them from standing up against this brutality or documenting it. As a result, there are limited written records of these atrocities in history. The stories of these women highlight the immense suffering and injustice they endured during pregnancy and childbirth, as part of the institution of slavery. Their experiences, long hidden from history, compel us to confront this painful chapter of our past. However, there exist historical accounts and records that illuminate these cruel practices. One such account comes from Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman who managed to escape from slavery in North Carolina in 1842. In her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs vividly describes the use of birthing chairs and how they were employed to restrain and subdue enslaved women during childbirth. She also provides first-hand accounts of the trauma and physical harm inflicted through the practice of pelvic breaking. Another account stems from a physician named James Marion Sims. Sims conducted dreadful experiments and surgeries on enslaved women. It is important to note that these practices were not confined to the United States, but also occurred in other regions of the world where slavery was present, such as the Caribbean and South America. In Jamaica, for instance, birthing chairs were reportedly used, and in Brazil, accounts of pelvic breaking have been documented. The horrors faced by pregnant women on slave breeding farms extended beyond imagination. These women were subjected to medical experiments and surgeries, serving as subjects for experiments that included testing new surgical procedures, experimenting with new drugs and medications, and even being used as guinea pigs for medical research. Among these medical practitioners was Dr. James Marion Sims, a renowned figure in the field of gynecology. Regrettably, his pioneering work in gynecology was built upon the exploitation of enslaved black women, whom he experimented on without their consent and without administering anesthesia. Sims held the false belief that black women did not experience pain in the same manner as white women, and thus saw no need to provide anesthesia during his surgeries. He performed numerous experiments and surgeries on enslaved women, sometimes subjecting a single woman to up to 30 surgeries. Many of these surgeries aim to treat conditions like vesicovaginal fistulas, which result from complications during childbirth and cause incontinence. Sims conducted these experiments using makeshift tools, including a shoemaker's awl and a borrowed silver spoon from his wife. After developing a successful surgical technique on black women, Sims applied it to white women, who were afforded anesthesia during the procedures. Enslaved women who eventually gave birth had no say in the lives of their babies. These infants were not considered their own, but rather the property of their white masters from birth. Frequently, these children were separated from their mothers as soon as they were weaned, sometimes as early as 6 weeks old, and sold to other slave owners. They were regarded as mere commodities to be traded and exploited as their owners saw fit. The conditions under which these children were raised were incredibly harsh. They were forced to engage in strenuous labor from a very young age, either toiling in the fields or working within the homes of their masters. They were stripped of rights, freedoms, and any hope for a better life. Born into slavery, their destiny was sealed from their very first breath. One particularly gruesome instance of this practice took place in Louisiana in the mid-1800s, involving a plantation owner named James H. Whitaker. Whitaker owned over 300 slaves and had a reputation for cruelly selling off the children of enslaved women as soon as they were weaned. He maintained a nursery on his plantation to house these babies until they were of an age to be sold. The conditions in this nursery were abhorrent, with infants kept in squalid, confined spaces, often suffering from illness and malnutrition. Upon being sold, they were permanently separated from their mothers, never to be reunited. It is crucial to recognize that this horrific practice was not isolated but widespread throughout the American South, persisting throughout the entire period of slavery. mothers were compelled to witness the heart-wrenching separation from their children, who were torn away, never to be seen or heard from again. This practice was so ingrained that it was even codified into law in some states. For example, in Virginia, a law passed in 1662 stipulated that a child's status was determined by its mother's status. Consequently, if a child's mother was enslaved, the child, regardless of its father's status, was born into slavery. This law, which remained in effect until the end of slavery in the United States, led to the systematic separation of families and the sale of children once they were weaned. It is estimated that over 400,000 children were born to enslaved women in Virginia alone, with many sold to other slave owners, never to be reunited with their families. As we reflect on this dark chapter in our history, we must acknowledge that the legacy of slavery continues to affect the lives of black women today. We must recognize the ways in which racism and inequality persist, particularly in the experiences of black women. Our duty is to work toward a future where every individual is treated with dignity and respect. We must not forget these stories and must strive to ensure that such atrocities never occur again. Let us learn from the past to create a more just and equitable future, where the mistreatment of any human being is not tolerated. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to our channel to stay updated and receive more content like this.